the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, issued a formal apology for his country's role in the slave trade on Monday. In a slave trade. I don't want to say the slave trade because humanity has had many over many centuries. So this brings up the question that I would like to talk about is, should the West be making apologies and reparations for slave trade, especially for people who don't own slaves, have never had anything to do with it? This is a nice time to talk about this. Slavery is unequivocally a bad thing. My concern here, though, is about pretending that it was the invention of Westerners and making Westerners pay for it, because it seems to be this sort of religious-like revival that anyone who's not a descendant of a slave needs to mea culpa for their race. And I'm concerned about it because I think it ignores the concerns of actual slaves today that there are. And also it ignores a lot of history. Slavery existed in biblical times. It wasn't even new then. The Mongols enslaved, the Turks enslaved. White people did not invent slavery or even the slave trade. African nations where slaves were pulled from during the Dutch slave trade were complicit in selling those slaves. In many cases, people were sold from African nations by Africans for items as basic as such as gin and mirrors, according to Candace Owen, in her book about this, her specific part about reparations. She points out that the only places where slavery exists today are in non-white nations. So is this an attempt to turn our heads away from actual slavery by asking people to apologize for it so we don't see where it's actually happening? In Africa today, there are child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor.
It's happening at our border in the United States.
Yes.
As we speak, it's happening right now.
Yes. So is that maybe more important than a mea culpa from 160 years ago? Further, the slave trade that we're talking about, that the Dutch are apologizing for, did not only go west, it went east too. This is from Douglas Murray's book, War on the West. He says the best figures available, proposed by scholars such as Professor Ralph Austin of the University of Chicago, is that somewhere between 11 and 17 million Africans were traded east in the Arab-run slave trade. One reason why these numbers are so difficult to discern is that unlike transatlantic trade, the Arabs traded were systematically castrated after being brought from Africa, which of course ensured that there was neither a second generation of slaves nor any descendants. So, again, we have to look in both directions here if we want to really make any apologize. And, 15, what is the number? 11 to 17 million. The Dutch prime minister this week was apologizing for 600,000 slaves. Watch.
Tot 1814 werden ruim 600.000 tot slaafgemaakte Afrikaanse vrouwen, mannen en kinderen onder erbarmelijke omstandigheden naar het Amerikaanse continent
in
verscheept
deplorable conditions,
door
he
Nederlandse
says, by
slavenhandelaren.
Dutch slave traders.
So we're missing the story here of millions more by many magnitudes if we focus on the West. Is that helpful in what I think is our collective goal of preventing slavery and promoting unity? The Netherlands enslaved nearly 160 years ago. The prime minister's speech was 20 minutes at the National Archives. And instead of reparations, he says he's establishing a 200 million euro fund to help tackle the legacy of slavery in the Netherlands and its former colonies to boost education about the issue. So there will be money there.
Great.
And it's specifically around, let's combat racism that's still around. Let's combat disadvantages. But a lot of black leaders are saying that's not enough. We actually want the money to people. One black leader of a black activist group did not attend the speech due to the lack of direct payments to descendants. And so he called this speech insulting, which raises an important question. And I want to ask it sensitively, but I think we should talk about it. No one alive today participated in the Dutch slave trade. So should current taxpayers bear this burden? The way this is argued in woke universities, and I come from them, so I know, is that the slave trade held back generations of wealth, like when you play a monopoly board. So one group has been playing for generations, buying up properties, collecting go, passing going past go and collecting 200. You don't collect go, you pass go and you collect $200, and they've been building up wealth. And one group has not been able to play. So how can that group catch up? The problem with this analogy that I have repeated before myself is that most generational wealth does not pass down. You and I both know this from our financial education. This is the problem with wealthy parents, either that or lack of a financial education.
Famously, the Vanderbilts.
Yes, I'm going to get to the Vanderbilts, is that most families don't figure out how to teach their children how to build or maintain wealth. That's true. It's statistically true. For more on this, absolutely, I suggest a book by Andrew Howell and David York called Entrusted, Building a Legacy That Lasts, where he talks about generational wealth. And so while slavery by the West unequivocally held one group back from obtaining wealth, most generational wealth does not pass down more than 1 to 2 generations. In fact, you're right, the Vanderbilts were poor within 2 generations of the peak of their wealth.
Right. So the idea that, all of these generations have just built up such incredible capital that no one can possibly catch up to them, because every family just hands down wealth. They just hand down all of this money. They do 1031 exchange programs, and then they hand it down where they don't pay taxes on a death tax. And these families are just living in palatial mansions. And that's not happening at all.
Yes.
Very, very, very small number. I mean, we talk about 1%. No. It's like 0.01%. That is where that's happening. The Kennedys, for instance. Like, you can name these families like on one hand, really.
Yes. So that again brings up the idea of money. We just talked about the stimulus, the COVID stimulus, how most of that money, those direct payments, has already come and gone. And so are we really thinking that there will ever be a money amount? Now, I have read, I can't remember the author's name, who talked about England's war on India, who said that reparations should be $1 or £1, so that at least the Crown and the British government, admits they did wrong, sends £1 to India so it doesn't impact current taxpayers. That's an idea. I'm not sure.
It's just symbolic.
It's symbolic, right?
And put up a monument,
I think most people would find that more upsetting.
And by the way, in the Netherlands, they already have a big monument of the slave trade. I mean, they have a huge monument with chains and statues and everything else. So they already have it. What about this money, $160 million for all of the farmers who you're now putting out of business and destroying your country and you're setting your country back hundreds of years? You're literally taking the Netherlands and sending it back 100 years by what you're now doing to the farmers.
Yes. So, I see a super chat here that says, let's be real, this money is owed. But by who is an important question, and to who is an important question. Someone like me, my descendants, I come from people who worked in plantations in Puerto Rico and Hawaii. But I'm half European and then half these. So would it be me because I also come from, a slave labor group. I don't know. Go ahead, David. What are you going to say?
I was just going to say, I saw somebody talking about this on Facebook, and I was like, how do you even track that? How do you even start to come up with a way to make that? Like, we can't even balance our budget in this country, and yet we're going to do something like that. And it's like, do you have, what about slave owners that had children with their slaves? Like, do they get a lesser percent? Like, how do you even go back and do that? And another thing, John Legend, who is a singer-songwriter, pointed out, we have more black people incarcerated for nonviolent offenses in this country right now than there were slaves in slave times.
Wow.
So I think we need to deal with the current slave problem before we move on to think about reparations. Oh,
that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it that way. Now, here's a quote from the Associated Press of someone who was a descendant of slaves saying, it's about money. Apologies are words, and with those words, you can't buy anything. So I come back to this question. If generational wealth does not pass down, is it really about money? Because it won't fix your children's lives. So then what? Or is this just some sort of like transfer of wealth and power that we want to see as a plenary moment for the West? Here is what I think is the biggest existential issue with this. And I want to raise this with all sincerity and not lead you by how I ask it. So I'm going to try and ask it without any nuance. What the Dutch Prime Minister says is that slavery is doing harm to people even today. Watch.
Wij, levend in het hier en nu, kunnen slavernij alleen in de allerduidelijkste bewoordingen erkennen en veroordelen als misdaad tegen de menselijkheid. Als een misdadig systeem dat wereldwijd onnoemelijk veel mensen, onnoemelijk veel en groot leed heeft gebracht. En dat doorwerkt in de levens van mensen hier en nu.
Okay.
Do you want to sum up what he said
So
for people?
he says that suffering still exists today because of slavery. Now, I want to, we've talked about how you quantify that. How do you quantify how it exists today? But here's my bigger question. Whose is it to forgive? Is it mine to forgive the pain of my ancestors any more than it is mine to pay for the sins of my ancestors? Here's something, an anecdote that I'll leave you with, again, from Douglas Murray's book. In 1969, a man named Simon Wiesenthal published a book about his experience as a Holocaust survivor. When he was in the Lemberg concentration camp, at one point he was pulled from the line and taken to the bedside of a dying Nazi. The man confessed to having participated in untold atrocities. He had, for instance, set a house on fire with hundreds of Jewish people inside, and he and his colleagues had shot them as they tried to escape. More awful, awful crimes against humanity. The man, the Nazi, who is called Karl S. in this book, brought Wiesenthal to his bedside as a sort of deathbed confession, and here's how Murray tells it. He says, what happens next after this deathbed confession of awful atrocity is what makes Wiesenthal's book so memorable. For after the SS soldier had finished his tale and the reader perhaps expects some sort of reconciliation, Wiesenthal gets up and leaves the room without saying a word. Later, Wiesenthal meditates on whether he did the right thing, and the second half of the book is given over to a symposium involving a range of thinkers and religious leaders who contribute their thoughts on the events that Wiesenthal described. It's notable, incidentally, that many of the Christians who contributed to this symposium believe that Wiesenthal should have offered some kind of forgiveness to the soldier. But the broader consensus that emerges from the contributors is that Wiesenthal did the right thing. And if there is a reason that it comes down to this, that Wiesenthal, although he was a Jew, like the soldier's victims, had neither the right nor the ability to forgive the soldier for what he had done. In order for true forgiveness to occur, the parties involved must not be the only one who has done the wrong, but the one to whom the wrong was done. So again, here's the question. Whose is it to forgive? If you receive a paycheck, does that, or a racism program or anything like that, is that yours? Does that make it right? Again, I don't want to lead you to a conclusion. I just ask in earnest, because these reparations discussions, my fear is, do not include all guilty parties. We've established that. Do not do anything about slavery currently happening. Do not guarantee generational wealth, because pretty much nothing does. And it leads to an attitude that people alive today have anything to do with this. And it creates rituals of forgiveness that are disproportionate. So I leave it to you to say, do you think that someone accepting money or a program can actually forgive the sins of somebody else on behalf of somebody else? And we welcome your thoughts.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at Redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to Redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.